Hello, Digital Dragons, and welcome to another issue of the Dragon Debrief Middle School Edition. For those of you that aren't aware, the Dragon Debrief is an informational video that we send out to all learning coaches, parents, as well as just the community in terms of what we are doing over here at Indiana Gateway over at the middle school level. And for this specific issue, we will be focusing on our specific staff. I know a large factor when it comes to online learning that sometimes it's hard to put a face specifically to a name. And I felt like advocating for our staff and as well as trying to inform all of you about who our staff are will be extremely tremendous for all of you in the long run. So let's go ahead and get started. Starting out with our admin team, I hope all of you are aware, my name is Mr. Payne and I am the middle school principal over here at Indiana Gateway. Next, we have Mr. Sinicki. Mr. Sinicki is actually our special programs administrator, and he actually focuses on all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. He plays a huge factor in our school. We also have Melissa Dion. Melissa is actually our instructional coach over here at the middle school level and focuses a lot primarily on helping teachers and assisting them with their instructional practices. And then we also have Bree Schmidt, who is actually our new middle school counselor, and she is absolutely phenomenal in the sense of actually advocating for students as well as just helping with scheduling and counseling sessions and so on and so forth. So that is our admin team. Next, we are going to transition over to our English department. First, we have Mrs. Clifton. Mrs. Clifton is actually our 6th grade English teacher, as well as the 6th grade team lead. She is absolutely phenomenal. Next, we have Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson is actually the 7th grade English teacher, as well as the department lead for the English department. We then have Mrs. Pettit. Mrs. Pettit is actually brand new with us this year. She is actually our 8th grade English teacher, and we are extremely excited to have her. And we also have Mrs. Chrisman. Mrs. Chrisman is actually our brand new 7th and 8th grade English as well as math teacher over here, and we are extremely to have her with us as well. Next, we are going to move on to our math department. So our math department, we have Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore is actually our 6th grade math teacher over here at Indiana Gateway. We then have Mrs. Besser. Mrs. Besser is actually the 7th grade math teacher, but she is also our math department lead as well. And then we have Mrs. Sanders. Mrs. Sanders is the 8th grade math teacher as well as the 8th grade team lead at that level as well. And then again, we have Mrs. Chrisman because she is teaching both 7th and 8th grade English as well as math this year. Next, our science department. We have Mr. Hartshorn. He is actually our 6th grade science teacher over here. We then have Mrs. McDivitt, and she is actually our 7th grade science teacher over here at Indiana Gateway. Next, we have Mrs. Carbley. Mrs. Carbley is the 8th grade science teacher, as she is also our science lead or a science department lead here over at Indiana Gateway. And then we have Mrs. Springer. Mrs. Springer is also a brand new teacher to Indiana Gateway, and she will be kind of focusing on both 7th and 8th grade at the science level, as well as 7th and 8th grade at the social studies level as well. Moving on to our social studies department, we have Mrs. Ryder. Mrs. Ryder is actually our 6th grade social studies teacher over here. We then have Mrs. Barr. Mrs. Barr is actually our 7th grade social studies teacher, as well as our social studies department lead. We then have Mr. Logan, who is actually our 8th grade science teacher, as well as Mrs. Springer, who, like I stated earlier, is teaching a little bit of 7th and 8th grade social studies as well as science. Next, we're going to transition over to the electives department. We actually have Mr. Ponchin. Mr. Ponchin is actually our CTE director, mainly deals primarily with a lot of the career courses that we offer here at the middle school level, and he is also our electives department lead as well. We then have Mrs. Spangler. Mrs. Spangler is the head of art, and she does an absolutely tremendous job at engaging kids and getting them engaged within art itself. We also have Mrs. Powell. Mrs. Powell is our PE and health teacher over here at Indiana Gateway. And then new this year, we have Mrs. Theobald, who is actually our Spanish teacher, and she is working tirelessly to get everybody up to date on Spanish, so that way we can offer it to the majority of our students. Next, we are going to move over to special programs. So some of our special programs teachers, we have Mrs. Pedigo Plummer. She is actually the special programs team lead over here at the middle school level. We also have Mrs. Kinsley. Mrs. Kinsley is also one of our 6th grade special programs teachers. We have Mrs. LaRue as well as Mrs. Lulin, who are both also our 7th grade special programs teachers over here at Indiana Gateway Middle School. Furthering on to our special programs teachers, we have Mrs. Hensley, who is actually one of our 8th grade special programs teachers, as well as Mrs. Evans, who is also one of our 8th grade special programs teachers as well. Then we have Mrs. Dubé. Mrs. Dubé is actually one of our special programs leads in terms of case conferences in 504. And then we have Mrs. Caruso, who is actually our English language learner director and teacher here over at Indiana Gateway as well. And then lastly, we have our paraprofessional teachers, which are Mrs. Boss, as well as Mrs. Brigham Lampley. Now, I will say, if you go through this slide, which will be available for you, you should have access to every single teacher's email address, as well as their BREA contact information in terms of their phone number, in order for you to be able to reach out to you. As always, the main point of contact for any teacher is always for anybody is always to reach out to your homeroom teacher first. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Other than that, go Digital Dragons and let them know.